Hello, friends, companions, compadres, creatures of life, students. This is going to go into my psychology lecture series, although this is not a lecture. What I will be doing, essentially, is I will be going through the history of modern psychology. This is the 11th edition of Schultz and Schultz's History of Modern Psychology. It's by Cengage, and this publication was issued in 2016. So it basically is going to go over the entire field of psychology since it became a formed discipline in the 19th century. And each video is going to basically go through a reading of this entire book. This entire book is about 300 pages of material in the history of psychology, as it has been a modernized discipline separate from philosophy. If you want to check out philosophy, I have a philosophical playlist. I also have a history playlist as well, and a science playlist, as well as a theology playlist. So there's enough here that anyone that is listening can find something that they might be interested in. This is mostly for psychology students. So, as my doctorate is in psychology, my master's in history, my bachelor's in theology, and my associate's in arts. So, enough of me. We're going to get into it. So, we asked the question, the study of the history of psychology. Why study the history of psychology? Well, it's the fact that psychology courses are being offered at schools, and it indicates that the faculties believe that it is important for students to learn about the history of their particular field. Courses in the history of psychology have been taught since 1911, and many colleges require them for psychology majors. A survey of 374 colleges found that 83% provided coursework in the history of psychology. Another survey of 311 psychology departments reported that 93% offered such courses. Of all the sciences, psychology is unique in this regard. The majority of scientific departments do not offer studies in the history of their fields, nor does the faculty of those departments consider the history of their disciplines to be vital to their students' development. As a historian, I argue otherwise. In determining how this academic interest in the history of the field helps you to understand psychology today, consider what you already know from taking other psychology courses, namely that there is no single form, approach, or definition of psychology on which all psychologists agree. You have learned that there is an enormous diversity, even divisiveness, and fragmentation in professional and scientific specializations and in subject matter. Some psychologists focus on cognitive functions, where others deal with unconscious forces, and still others work only with overt behavior or with psychological and biochemical processes. Modern psychology includes many subject areas that seem to have little in common beyond a broad interest in human nature and behavior, and an approach that attempts in some general way to be scientific. The only framework that binds these diverse areas and approaches and gives them a coherent context is their history, the evolution over time of psychology as an independent discipline. Only by exploring psychology's origins and development can we have an understanding of the nature of psychology. The knowledge of history brings order to disorder and imposes meaning on what might appear to be chaotic, putting the past into perspective to explain the present. Exploring people, events, and experiences of the past help to make clear the forces that have made psychology what it is today. This book shows that studying the history of psychology is the most systematic way to integrate the areas and issues of modern psychology. This course will enable you to recognize relationships among ideas, theories, research efforts to understand how the pieces of the psychological puzzle come together to form a coherent picture. We should add that the history of psychology is a fascinating story on its own merits, offering drama, tragedy, heroism, and revolution, and its fair share of sex, drugs, and in some really weird people. And despite false starts, mistakes, and misconceptions, you will see that overall there is a clear and continuing evolution that has shaped contemporary psychology and provides us with an explanation for its rich history. The beginning of modern psychology. Here is another question. For our study of the history of psychology, where do we start? The answer depends on how we define psychology. Its origins can be traced to two different time periods, some 2,000 years apart. Thus, psychology is both one of the oldest of all scholarly disciplines and one of the newest. First, we can trace ideas and speculations about human nature and behavior back to the 5th century BCE, when Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek philosophers grappled with many of the same issues that concern psychologists today. These ideas include some of the basic topics you covered in your introductory psychology classes, like memory, learning, motivation, thought, perception, and abnormal behavior. These seem to be little disagreement among historians of psychology that the views of our forebears over the past 2,500 years set the framework within which practically all subsequent work has been done. This one possible starting point for a study of the history of psychology would take us all the way back to ancient philosophical writings about problems that latter came to be included in the formal discipline we know as psychology. Conversely, we could choose to view psychology as one of the newer fields of study and begin our coverage approximately only 200 years ago, when modern psychology emerged from philosophy and other early scientific approaches to claim its own unique identity as a formal field of study. How should we distinguish between modern psychology, which we cover in this book, and its roots, that is, the prior centuries of its intellectual forerunners? That distinction has less to do with the kinds of questions asked about human nature than with the methods used to try to answer those questions. It is the approach taken and the techniques employed that distinguish the older discipline of philosophy from modern psychology, and that mark the emergence of psychology as a separate, primarily scientific field of study. Until the last quarter of the 19th century, philosophers studied human nature by speculating, intuiting, and generalizing based on their own experience. However, a major transformation occurred when philosophers began to apply the tools and methods already successful in the biological and physical sciences to explore questions about human nature. Only when researchers came to rely on carefully controlled observation and experimentation to study the human mind did psychology begin to attain an identity separate from its philosophical roots. The new discipline of psychology needed precise and objective ways of dealing with its subject matter. Much of the history of psychology after its separation from its roots in philosophy is the story of the continuing development of tools, techniques, and methods to achieve this increased precision and objectivity, refining not only the questions psychologists ask, but also the answers they obtain. If we seek to understand the complex issues that define and divide psychology today, then a more appropriate starting point for the history of the field is the 19th century, a time when psychology became an independent discipline with distinctive methods of inquiry and theoretical rationales. Although it is true, as we noted, that philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle concerned themselves vastly different from those of today's psychologists, they still concern themselves with problems that are still of general interest. Those scholars were not psychologists in the contemporary usage of the term. A noted scholar of the history of psychology, Kurt Danziger, refers to the early philosophical approaches to questions of human nature as the prehistory of modern psychology. He believes that the history of psychology is limited to the period when psychology recognizably emerges as a disciplined subject matter, and that it is extremely problematical to talk about psychology as having a history before that. The idea that the methods of the physical and biological sciences could be applied to the study of mental phenomena was inherited from both philosophical thought and physiological investigations of the 17th to 19th centuries. That exciting era forms the immediate background or historical context out of which modern psychology emerged, and that is where we will begin. We shall see that while the 19th century philosophers were clearing the way for an experimental attack on the functioning of the mind, psychologists were independently approaching some of the same problems from a different direction. The 19th century physiologists were making great strides towards understanding the bodily mechanisms underlying mental processes. Their methods of study differed from those of the philosophers, but the eventual union of these disparate disciplines, philosophy and physiology, produced a new field of study that quickly earned its own identity and stature. Although the majority of psychologists agree that psychology is a science, surveys of the general population indicate that up to 70% of the general public remain skeptical of psychology's scientific status. We hope that by the end of this course you will see that much of the field of psychology today continues to advance through the use of increasingly rigorous scientific methodology. The data of history, reconstructing psychology's past. How do we know what really happened? In this book, A History of Modern Psychology, we are dealing with two disciplines, history and psychology, using the methods of history to understand the development of psychology, because our coverage of the evolution of psychology depends on the methods of history. Let's introduce briefly the notion of historiography, which refers to the techniques and principles employed in historical research. I took a class, my second graduate class was on historiography. Historiography, briefly, is the principles, methods, and philosophical issues of historical research. Historians face several problems that psychologists do not share. The data of history, that is, the materials historians use to reconstruct lives, events, and eras, differ markedly from the data of science. The most distinctive feature of scientific data is the way they are gathered or collected. For example, if psychologists want to investigate the circumference under which people act to help those in distress, or whether children imitate aggressive behavior they see on television or in video games, then they will construct situations or establish conditions from which data can be generated. A psychologist may conduct a laboratory experiment, observe behavior under controlled real-world conditions, take a survey, or calculate the statistical correlation between two variables. In using these methods and data analysis, scientists have a measure of control over the situations or events they choose to study. In turn, those events can be reconstructed or replicated by other scientists at other times and places. Thus, the data can be verified later by establishing conditions similar to those of the original study and repeating the observations. In contrast, the data of history cannot be reconstructed or replicated. Each situation occurred at some time in the past, perhaps centuries ago, and historians might not have bothered to record the particulars of the event at the time, or even to record the details accurately. Today's historians cannot control or reconstruct past events to examine them in light of present knowledge. If the historical incident itself has been lost to view, then how can historians deal with it? What data can they use to describe it, and how can we possibly know for sure what happened? Although historians cannot repeat a situation to generate pertinent data, they still have significant information to consider. The data of past events are available to us as fragments. Descriptions written by participants or witnesses, letters and diaries, photographs and pieces of old laboratory equipment, interviews and other official accounts and documents. It is from these sources, that is, these data fragments, that historians try to recreate and the events and experiences of the past, a reconstruction of the past. This approach is similar to that of archaeologists, who work with fragments of past civilizations and their material cultures, such as arrowheads, shards of clay pots, or human bones, and try to describe the characteristics of those civilizations from such objects. Some archaeological excavations yield more detailed data fragments than others, allowing for more accurate reconstructions. Similarly, with excavations in history, the data fragments may be so great as to leave little doubt about the accuracy of the account. In other instances, however, the data fragments may be lost, distorted, or otherwise compromised. I wrote my master's thesis on archaeological methodologies, historical, archaeological, methodological approaches. History lost and found. In some cases, the historical record is incomplete because data has been lost, sometimes deliberately. Consider the case of John B. Watson, which we will find in Chapter 10, the founder of the behaviorism school of thought. Before John Watson died in 1958 at the age of 80, he systematically burned his letters, his manuscripts, and research notes, destroying the entire unpublished record of his life and career. And this data has been lost forever. Sometimes data has been misplaced. In 2006, more than 500 handwritten pages were discovered in a household cupboard in England. They were determined to be the official writings of Royal Society meetings for the years 1661 to 1682, recorded by Robert Hooke, one of the most brilliant scientists of his time. The papers revealed early work done with a new scientific tool, the microscope, and detailed the discovery of bacteria and spermatozoa. Also included was Hooke's correspondence with Sir Isaac Newton about the subject of gravity and the movement of the planets. In 1984, the papers of Hermann Ebbinghaus, which we will see in Chapter 4, who was prominent in the study of learning and memory, were found some 75 years after his death. In 1983, 10 large boxes were uncovered that contained the handwritten diaries of Gustav Fechner, who we will see in Chapter 3, who developed psychophysics. These diaries covered the period between 1828 to 1879, a significant time in the early history of psychology. Yet for more than 100 years, psychologists were unaware of their existence. Many authors had written books about the work of Ebbinghaus and Fechner without having access to these important collections of personal papers. Charles Darwin, which we will mention in Chapter 6, has been the subject of more than 200 biographies. Surely we can assume that the written record of Darwin's life and work would be accurate and complete by now. But yet, as early as 1990, well over 100 years after Darwin's death, large amounts of new material became available, including notebooks and personal letters that were not available for consideration by early biographers. Uncovering these new fragments of history means that more pieces of the puzzle can be set in place. In rare and bizarre instances, the data of history may be stolen and not recovered, if at all, for many years. In 1641, an Italian mathematician stole more than 70 letters written by the French philosopher René Descartes, which we will mention in Chapter 2. One of the letters was discovered in 2010 in a collection housed at a college in the United States. It was subsequently returned to France. Altered and hidden history. Other data may be hidden deliberately or altered to protect the reputation of the people involved. Sigmund Freud's first biographer, Ernest Jones, intentionally minimalized Freud's use of cocaine, commenting in a letter, "I'm afraid that Freud took more cocaine than he should, though I'm not mentioning that in my biography." He said, "We will see when we discuss Freud in Chapter 13 that recently uncovered data confirmed Freud's cocaine use for a longer period than Jones was willing to admit in print. When the correspondence of the psychoanalyst Carl Jung was published, the letters were selected and edited in such a way as to present a favorable impression of Jung and his work. In addition, it was revealed that Carl Jung's so-called autobiography was written not by him, but by a loyal assistant. Jung's words were altered or deleted to conform to the image preferred by his family and disciples. Unflattering material was, of course, left out. In a similar instance, the scholar who cataloged the papers of Wolfgang Kohler in Chapter 12, a founder of the school of thought known as Gestalt psychology, was perhaps too devoted an admirer. When he oversaw the selection of materials for publication, he restricted selected information to enhance Kohler's image. The papers had been carefully selected to present a favorable profile. A latter historian reviewing the papers confirmed the basic problem with the data of history, namely the difficulty of determining the extent to which a set of papers is true representation of a person or a slanted one, or slanderous one, either favorable or unfavorable, biased by the person who selected the papers to be made public. The data of history may also be affected by the actions of the participants themselves in recounting pivotal events. People may, consciously or unconsciously, produce biased accounts to protect themselves or enhance their public image. For example, Freud liked to depict himself as a martyr to his psychoanalytic cause, a visionary who was scorned, rejected, and vilified by the medical and psychiatric establishment of the day. Freud's first biographer, Ernest Jones, reinforced those claims in his books. And of course, you have people like Julius Caesar, who wrote about himself as well on his journeys against the Gauls. Date uncovered later revealed a totally different situation. Freud's work had not been ignored during his lifetime. By the time Freud was middle-aged, his ideas were exerting an immense influence on the younger generation of intellectuals. His clinical practice was thriving, and he could be described as a celebrity. Freud himself had clouded the record. The false impression he fostered was perpetuated by several biographers, and for decades, our understanding of Freud's influence during his lifetime was inaccurate. These instances illustrate only the difficulties faced by scholars and historians in assessing the worth of historical materials. Excuse me. Are the documents or other data fragments accurate representations of the person's life and work? Or have they been chosen to foster a certain impression, whether positive, negative, or somewhere in between? Another biographer stated the problem in this way. The more I study human character, the more convinced I become that all records, all reminiscences are to a greater or lesser degree based on illusions. Whether the distorting lens is that of bias, vanity, sentimentality, or simple inaccuracy, there was no absolute truth. So that is very shocking. That is a very shocking statement. All right. Freud put the matter even more bluntly. Anyone who writes a biography is committed to lies, concealment, hypocrisy, flattering, and even to hiding his own lack of understanding. For biographical truth does not exist. I disagree. But anyways, in another example of hidden or suppressed data fragments, in the more than 70 years since Freud's death in 1939, many of his papers and letters have been published or released to scholars. In 2011, the first volume of Freud's 1,500 letters to the woman he would marry was finally published. They had been kept secret for all those years. A huge collection consisting of 153 boxes of Freud's papers is held by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Some of these documents will not be made available for many more years at the request of the Freud estate. The formal reason for this restriction is to protect the privacy of Freud's patients and their families, and perhaps also the reputation of Freud and his family. One letter to Freud from his eldest son is sealed until 2032. Correspondence with his nephew is being held until 2050. A letter from one of Freud's mentors will not be released until 2102, some 177 years after the man's death, leaving us to wonder what could be so remarkable about that letter as to require such secrecy for such a long period of time. Some collections, including letters to his daughter, Anna, and his sister-in-law, are held in perpetuity, meaning there is no release date for them at all. Psychologists do not know how these archival documents and manuscripts will affect our understanding of Freud and his work. Until these data fragments are available for study, however, our knowledge of one of psychology's pivotal figures remains incomplete and perhaps inaccurate. Changing the words of history, distortion and translation. Another problem with the data of history relates to information that comes to the historian through faulty translation from one language to another. We refer to Freud again for examples of the misleading impact of translations. Not many psychologists are sufficiently fluent in the German language to read Freud's original work. Most people rely on a translator's choice of the most appropriate words and phrases, but the translation does not always convey the author's original intent, authorial intent. Three fundamental concepts in Freud's theory of personality are id, ego, and superego, obviously, terms with which you are already familiar. However, these words do not represent Freud's ideas precisely. These words are the Latin equivalents of Freud's German words: id for ace, which literally translates as it; ego for ich, which means I; and superego for über ich, or above I. So, es, ich, über ich. Freud wanted to describe something intimate and personal with his use of ich, or I, and to distinguish it from ace, it, the latter being something distinct from or foreign to I. The translator's use of the words ego and id instead of I and it turned these personal concepts into cold technical terms which arouse no personal associations. Thus, the distinction between I and it, ego and id, is not as forceful for us as Freud intended. Consider Freud's term free association. Here the word association implies a connection between one idea or thought and another, as though each one acts as a stimulus to elicit the next one in a chain. This is not what Freud proposed, and his term in German was Einfall, which does not mean association. Literally, Einfall means an intrusion or an invasion. Freud's idea was not to describe a simple linking of ideas, but rather to denote something from the unconscious mind that is uncontrollably intruding into or invading conscious thought. Thus, our historical data, Freud's own words, were misinterpreted in the act of translation. An Italian proverb, traditor, or tradutor, to translate is to betray, makes this point clearly. What do these problems with the data of history tell us about our study of the history of psychology? They show us primarily that our understanding of history is dynamic. The story is constantly changing and growing and is redefined, enhanced, and corrected whenever new data is revealed or reinterpreted. Therefore, history cannot be considered finished or complete, just as science is. It is always in progress, a story without an ending. The historian's narrative may only approximate or approach the truth, but it does so more fully with each new finding or new analysis of the data fragments of history. Thank you. This is a lecture on the study of the history of psychology, the data of history, reconstructing psychology's past, and how we know how it really happened. The next lecture, or reading rather, will go over the forces that have shaped history, the forces that have shaped psychology in historical context. Thank you.